It was a day much like any other in 1335, when some laborers working in a quarry near Klagenfurt, Austria, made a truly astonishing discovery. It was a skull. Specifically, it was the skull of the now extinct woolly rhinoceros. It was clearly ancient, likely bore no resemblance to any other animal those laborers had ever seen. And it was big. Similar specimens have been found to be up to 90 centimeters long. From the get-go, to the people of Klagenfurt, the identity of the animal this skull belonged to was obvious. To them, clearly, it was the skull of a dragon. Duh. Right? Specifically, it was thought to be the skull of the lindworm, a dragon who was significant to mythologies all throughout Europe, but importantly for our sake, was thought to have been slain around Klagenfurt. These people likely would have believed in and thought of the death of the lindworm as a part of their local history. Upon finding a strange, somewhat menacing-looking skull that couldn't otherwise easily be explained, the people of Klagenfurt did their best to find an explanation. In 1590, Ulrich Vogelsang would be commissioned to make a statue of the lindworm for a fountain that would be featured prominently in the town square. Naturally, Vogelsang decided to use that very same skull as his model. After all, to him, and indeed to the people of Klagenfurt at large, that was the real skull of the real lindworm. Side note, but I guess that statue is still there, which is pretty cool. However, as I alluded to earlier, the Klagenfurt dragon was not a dragon. I am so sorry if I have to be the one to break this to you, but dragons aren't real. Specifically, it was the skull of a woolly rhinoceros, a type of Ice Age megafauna that was once abundant all throughout Europe, but went extinct roughly 15,000 years ago. It's easy to just write off this initial interpretation made by the people of Klagenfurt as outdated, superstitious nonsense. One may be tempted to throw it away with things like miasmas, and bloodletting, and the four humors, and, I don't know, young Earth creationism. After all, in a literal sense, they were wrong, but also, I can't help but to see their logic given the information they had available to them at the time. On that day, those laborers found something truly extraordinary, something that neither them nor the people of Klagenfurt could easily explain. Therefore, they did something not dissimilar to what modern scientists do. They built upon their pre-existing understanding of their own history and their understanding of the world around them to the best of their ability, come to a logical conclusion. This line of thinking raises questions like, why do the myths we have originate in the first place? Is it just random noise? Is it just fun storytelling and human imagination? Is it all random, or is there something more here? This is the principle guiding Adrian Mayer's book, The First Fossil Hunters, where Mayer clearly and concisely draws a direct link between the formation of myths such as these and fossil sites. Ever thought about why dragons are consistent to mythologies basically everywhere? Well, I mean, dinosaurs look kind of like dragons, right? What about giants? Giants are common to mythology, maybe even more so than dragons. Maybe, you might say, a giant is just an easy thing to come up with. It's like a regular person, but really big. Maybe, as Mayer asserts, myths of giants came from ancient humans finding mammoth bones, which, in isolation, look not super dissimilar to a human bone, right? Like, here's a femur, there's a femur. I can see it, even if it is maybe less likely than big person just being an easy thing to come up with. In doing so, Mayer does not present people of the past as being helplessly and foolishly superstitious, but as people whose inquiry was driven by reason, logic, and, even to some extent, observation, but who differed from us and were limited only by their framework and understanding of the world that they had available to them. So here's a fun thought experiment. That statue that Vogelsang sculpted in 1590, is that technically paleo art? Can we call that paleo art? Obviously, this sounds absurd. The idea of paleo art wasn't even a concept for another couple hundred years, and these people would have been totally unaware of the most fundamental driving forces behind modern science, and by extension, paleo art, like evolution and the scientific method. But again, it is, at the very least, a very similar process, right? Like, at least in a general sense. Much like modern paleontologists do, the artist used his pre-existing understanding of the animal in question, an animal that he had never seen in real life, to reconstruct it based on its skull. In a way, this isn't like super different from all those old depictions of T-Rex that you used to see in museums as a kid that we now know were pretty inaccurate. Granted, it's on a much bigger scale in terms of wrongness, but... And in case you think this is just a one-time thing, it's not even just Klagenfurt. Farmers in western China have long reported finding dragon bones in areas that we now know are rich in dinosaur fossils. At least as far back as antiquity, Europeans across cultures have had traditions around collecting Neolithic hand axes and stone tools, referred to sometimes as Thunderstones, usually associating them with lightning strikes and weather deities. In her book, The First Fossil Hunters, Mayer ties early Greco-Roman myths of griffins, which were specifically thought to have lived in the Central Asian steppe, to a species of dinosaur called Protoceratops, whose fossils are now known to be scattered across the land today. And we'll be getting more into that later. According to Mayer, myths of griffins, which were noticeably treated differently than other myths, can be explained by people finding and trying to understand the fossils of Protoceratops. Obviously, this isn't science as we understand it today, but the logical processes that are at play here are at the very least recognizable, and in some cases are not all that different from the ones that fuel modern science today. The modern scientific method as we know it today came into being as a result of the scientific revolution, which, was a part of the Enlightenment, etc., etc. Hopefully you learned this in school. But if not, or if you forgot it, I'll have a video linked below that'll explain it way better than I can. For our purposes, it's important to note that the scientific method did not spontaneously emerge in a vacuum, but was instead the culmination of centuries of philosophy and rational thought. While early examples of empiricism and what looks a little bit like a prototype of what could eventually maybe be
scientific thinking
were explored by ancient thinkers in a school of philosophy that's now referred to as naturalism, the key tenets that define modern science, such as repeatable methods of testing fueled by a testable hypothesis and peer-reviewed research, were not widely practiced before the emergence of the scientific revolution. That said, popular media and popular thought, at least here in the West, often depicts people of the past as being illogical and fueled only by superstition. And that would be a mistake. Don't get me wrong, there is some of that, and the scientific revolution was a revolution for a reason. It was a new thing. However, by the time these events occurred, a lot of the ideas they were built upon were already hundreds and hundreds of years old. While none found the same widespread support as modern science, nor did any fill off all the correct boxes, a lot of philosophical movements in history got a lot closer than you might think. As in modern science, when ancient people came across something extraordinary, or just something they couldn't understand, they used logic and observation to build upon their existing worldview and understanding of the functioning of the universe around them to make an educated guess about what they were looking at. Even though the conclusions they would come to would often be demonstrably false, the process they used to get there was, at the very least, similar. In The First Fossil Hunters, Adrian Mayer asserts that griffins are one such creature. Now relegated to the realm of myth and magic, Mayer asserts that the origins of the griffin can be more easily explained as pre-modern interpretations of the fossils of an extinct species of animal. Griffins come to us in the modern day by way of the Greeks. And you'll notice that in Greco-Roman mythology, there's no shortage of similar animal hybrids, and most of these hybrids fit pretty neatly into the Greek mythological cycle. The Pegasus, for example, was one of Poseidon's children. The Hydra was the child of a giant and a half-woman, half-snake called the Echidna. And no, it's not that Echidna. And it's also not that Echidna. There we go, that's the one. But griffins aren't talked about this way. They're not mentioned in association with any other gods or goddesses, and they don't seem to have any myths really attached to them whatsoever, at least not ones that fit neatly in the Greek mythological cycle. In fact, ancient people don't seem to have thought of griffins as being mythological at all, and they're discussed less alongside the likes of Cyclops and Medusa, and are talked about a lot more in the way that you might talk about an exotic animal that just lives really far away, like, a zebra or something. And before you think that ancient people had to have been stupid for believing that such an animal could exist, have you considered the platypus? If you had never seen or heard of one before, and you saw some ancient Greek writer talking about it, a beaver-duck hybrid that lays eggs, and is still a mammal? That sounds absurd. Just saying. Additionally, where myths and mythological figures change and develop over time with the changing cultures, descriptions of griffins remain remarkably consistent and change surprisingly little over the centuries. In the 7th century BCE, Greek traveler Aristeas, when visiting an eastern group of Scythians called the Isodonians, was told of vast expanses of wilderness in the lands beyond Isodonia, where gold was fiercely guarded by griffins. Greek physician Theseus of Cnidus, whose name I'm sure I pronounced wrong, so that's his name, also talks about griffins and their gold hoarding tendencies, referring to them as, quote, a race of four-footed birds, almost as large as wolves and with legs and claws like lions. Later Roman writers, like Pliny the Elder, would also talk about griffins and would bring up these same features and tendencies. This is also the first time that griffins are described to have ears or wings. Even Herodotus, who... Okay, side note. If you're watching this video, I'm sure you've heard of Herodotus. I'm sure you know all about him. Father of history, father of lies. You know the drill. Well, Mayer refers to Herodotus as the world's first anthropologist. While a lot of Herodotus' stories that he wrote down were absurd, much of what he wrote was not stuff he claimed to personally see, but was just stories that he heard on his travels that he wrote down. In this way, you could kind of see Herodotus as an ancient record of oral and folkloric traditions that wouldn't have otherwise been written down. Kind of like ancient antiquities version of the Brothers Grimm. I thought that was interesting. Anyway, during Herodotus' time visiting the Black Sea Scythians, the locals would tell him stories of griffins that would guard stashes of gold in the east, as well as a strange race of one-eyed men called Arimaspians? Called Arimaspians. What's interesting is that Herodotus scoffs at and basically fully dismisses the possibility that there could be a race of one-eyed men somewhere, but he doesn't seem to have any problem with griffins. Griffins, throughout history, are consistently and reliably recorded as having a mixture of eagle and lion-like features, as having lived in Central Asia, lived subterranean or semi-subterranean lifestyles, dug burrows, hoarded massive stashes of gold, and were always thought to be vicious and violently territorial. And we know that these Greek and Roman accounts weren't just made up, because Scythian art predating the earliest known accounts of Greeks and Romans in the area seems to clearly depict griffins. In the ancient world, Scythia was famous as a source of gold, and thus the people of Scythia were famous for their gold and metalworking. As such, while the Scythians were largely a non-literate society, their art, which often came in the form of metalworking, was incredibly unique, very detailed, and can tell us a lot about them as a people. This period of Scythian art seems to be largely dominated by a style referred to as animal style, which makes heavy use of animalistic, zoological, and nature-based imagery. In the 1940s, Soviet archaeologist Sergei Rudenko conducted excavations of several Scythian tombs in the northern slopes of the Altai Mountains. Rudenko found a veritable treasure trove of gold artifacts carved in the animal style, many containing griffins. More astonishingly, however, was when Rudenko found the bodies of the people that these tombs likely belonged to. These two Scythian nomads had been mummified by the permafrost, and were so well preserved that Rudenko could still see their tattoos, which, like the gold artifacts, contained animal-style imagery and contained depictions of griffins. Across time, and seemingly even across cultures, these depictions of griffins remain relatively unchanging. Any given society's myths often change and evolve and shift over long periods of time. This remained firm. Mayer writes, quote, "The imagery of griffins did not follow any standard mythological narratives. Instead, the artists seemed to have been imagining the behavior of an unusual animal they had heard described but had never seen." It was in 1922 that American adventurer Roy Chapman Andrews first led an expedition, funded by the American Museum of Natural History, into the Gobi Desert. Andrews' interest had been piqued several years earlier after hearing about a variety of remarkable discoveries in the area. Andrews had actually embarked mostly looking for evidence of early hominins, but instead he found something else. He found dinosaur fossils, and he found a lot of them. Several of the specimens found on this expedition would be christened as new species. One of these, which would later be known as Protoceratops, belonged to the Ceratops family, and bore a noticeable resemblance to their better-known, larger, horned relatives, Triceratops. Lacking horns, the Protoceratops was a quadruped whose body averaged at about 2 meters long, or 4 to 6 feet long for the other Americans here. The Protoceratops had the body approximately the size of an adult lion, but with a vaguely avian-looking head and a strikingly fierce-looking beak. Do you see where I'm going with this? We then need to keep in mind that earlier societies such as this usually didn't really have a concept like extinction. For most people, if you came across the bones of a strange animal that you had never seen before, it seemed a lot more likely that you had just never seen one alive, but that they were still alive somewhere, right? Why would there be bones of a thing that didn't exist anymore? There would likely have been little reason to believe that the animal had died out entirely. Rather, you just haven't seen one alive before. Reading Mayer's work, I can't help but to be reminded of a book that, if you're watching this video, you've probably at least heard of before. All Yesterdays is a now somewhat popular book of speculative paleo art, whose goal is to not make specific assertions about the traits held by certain species of the past, but to question the way we reconstruct ancient and extinct species, and self-reflect upon what we could be missing on these reconstructions. This is emphasized by a section near the end titled All Todays, where the author reconstructs common, well-known modern animals in the way a paleontologist might reconstruct a species of extinct dinosaur. This highlights the fact that for many of these animals alive today, their most distinguishing features, be they behavioral or physical traits, are ones that would leave no trace in the paleontological record. For those curious, there's already several great videos on All Yesterdays and All Todays, and I will have them linked somewhere. This seemingly innate human desire to dig stuff up out of the ground and find out what it is also applies to human artifacts. Throughout Europe, there have been long-standing traditions around the finding of prehistoric lithic tools, hand axes, axe heads, and others, sometimes in this context referred to as Thunderstones, whereupon they would have mythological and even pseudo-magical properties placed upon them. As far back as antiquity, Thunderstones, which were thought to have fallen out of the sky during lightning strikes or thunderstorms or be related to some kind of thunder deity, these Thunderstones were often placed in buildings and houses as a sort of magical protection. As I've hopefully succeeded in illustrating in this video, the human curiosity and inquisitiveness that fuels modern science did not spontaneously spring into being during the scientific revolution. The way in which many of these ancient thinkers operated and came to the conclusions they did feels strikingly modern, and may even feel, in a certain sense, like an early form of science. But it's important to remember that it wasn't science. The novel aspects of the scientific method, repeatable testability, the peer review process, they're not just newer quirks of modern science. They're necessary features that make science what it is, that without them, you don't have science. When ancient people in antiquity came across Protoceratops fossils, and maybe labeled them as griffins, and indeed when those Austrian laborers in Klagenfurt came across a woolly rhinoceros skull and called it a dragon, they may have been wrong, but that doesn't mean that they were wrong to ask, or even that they were being irrational in the method they used to get there. They were doing what us as humans have always done. They were finding answers to extraordinary questions. The question of, what is this? Why is it here, and how did it get here, is a question that we have better tools now to answer than at any time in human history. But that doesn't mean we should blame the people who came before us for trying, even if they were wrong. Maybe even especially if they were wrong. After all, without them, where would we be today? Thanks for watching.